basically, we have a lot of roads on the forest landscape, and they have significant ecological impacts. This includes the 3,500 to 4,000 plus roads that still exist on the Mount Hood National Forest, which, as we've already heard, is a major source of drinking water and key salmon habitat. We also know that it's possible to drastically reduce those impacts through remediation of roads that we keep and through removal, obliteration, decommissioning, whatever you want to call it, roads that we no longer use. We also know that current policy direction creates a whole series of mandates that gives us all kinds of cover to do the right thing about these roads. And in fact, many of those are being re-emphasized and reworked repeatedly. The other thing that we know is that reducing sediment yield from the forests, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, will require significantly greater public investment than what we are seeing brought to the table today. On the Mount Hood, that would be one of the costs of water infrastructure that we need to address. That 4,000 or so miles of road is in fact, unfortunately, not even a fixed cost. It's an increasing cost if we don't address it and get a hold of it. And then the last thing, basically, that we are hoping that we can talk some today about what kind of new policy direction might assist the Mount Hood National Forest to continue as a leader. And John Frissell will talk some later about our policy recommendations that he's been working on. So basically, the ecological imperatives, I was just going to review very quickly the physical and biological impacts of roads. This is a map that probably Eric Fernandez put together at Oregon Wild, which I stole off his website, that shows the Mount Hood forest road system, which, as we heard first thing this morning from Gary Larson, has long been something that is really part of the strategic plan of the forest to address. So the first sort of way of looking at road impacts would be the hydrologic mechanisms, and Chris Frissell put this slide together for a presentation he did. We've got a few of the many, many citations that are out there sort of memorializing the different impacts of roads. The first one being the fact that roads basically create sort of a secondary stream network. They intercept flows and lead to the problem of increased peak flows, which is the flood problem that Steve talked about earlier today. You have higher peak flows, probably lower low flows. We also have the problem of sediment, which creates its problems downstream as well as in the immediate environment of the input. We have the problem of the roads, basically because they're connected to streams, create a new delivery mechanism for chemicals that we don't want in the streams. And we basically have diversion and ponding of flow paths, which is another sort of hydrologic result. These are not on the Mount Hood. I don't mean to imply that they are, but this is what a direct delivery of sediment to a stream looks like. We have a lot of these on every national forest that I've been on every piece of forest land that I've ever visited, and we can do a lot to decrease them. This is a photograph of a destabilization of a slope, usually that results from the more antiquated style of building roads to create there's usually a lot of fill that was used in the old logging roads when they were built, and they're highly susceptible to landslides, which, as you can see in these cases, deliver directly to water bodies. So biologically, all of those things translate into adverse impacts to habitat, which I won't really flog too much, except to say that they're well documented, they're real, they're significant, they're well noted in listing decisions of numerous aquatic species and in recovery plans. This juvenile coho is an example of the kind of species that requires cold, clear water, and for whom sediment from roads, the additional sediment over and above the natural background levels, is a real problem. So this is the guy we're managing for. This is the same kind of guy that the fish and farms analogy tells us sort of what it is that we need to do. So these guys are susceptible not just to catastrophic sediment, but to low, chronic, elevated levels of sediment too. And that's something that often isn't quite as well acknowledged as this kind of impact, which is basically from a landslide that was triggered by a road that killed the fish. Now, we don't want to have to see this in order to do something about the problem, and in fact, I think we are well past that point where we're requiring dead fish to be produced in order to admit that we have a problem. Another way of looking at impacts from roads is to look at road density, and it's a metric that we think is biologically relevant and is something that we should take into consideration when we're setting our management objectives. It's not the only metric that we should use. You can see that, let's see if I know how to use this. Some areas of the Mount Hood National Forest are in the 4 to 5 miles per square mile road density category. And when we start talking about significant ecological impacts, I think we're talking, you start getting worried about if you're talking about refugial habitat or habitat that we're really relying on to be there for aquatic species in a world that's getting increasingly more developed. The national forests provide that kind of habitat. We need to start worrying about 1 mile, 1.5 miles, certainly under 2 miles per square mile. Chris can correct me later if I got that wrong. So roads on the Mount Hood, we know from the watershed analyses on the forest, are no different from other forests that we've seen around the country. They are a source of increased chronic sediment to streams and slope instability and increased mass wasting. This is consistent with the situation on most forest lands in the United States, where sediment is the leading problem from forest lands, and much of that related to roads. We have about 3,400 open miles of road. I'm a little unclear as to how many miles we have on the ground. That's something that we think is very much worth looking at, that we need to really understand the hydrologic contributions and risks of all the roads that exist on the ground in order to say that we've really looked at the problem. We know we are looking at about 746 now planned for long-term closure. We also know we have high road densities, as I just mentioned. Climate change is going to make all of that more important to address. We're going to be having increased incidence of high-intensity storms, increased differentials from cool to warm. We're going to have thawing at different times of the year. All of that is going to, we heard about this earlier from the UW Climate Impact Group's model. All of that mitigates in favor of getting our watersheds in a resilient condition, and that means reducing the risks associated with roads. This is an extreme photograph, which I always like to use just because it's so dramatic. It's down in the Illinois Valley in Sucker Creek. This is the kind of thing that can happen in some geologies where you have a problem that doesn't look very big, that doesn't look like it needs attention. You have a number of small streams that have culverts that plug. They may drain onto the road now and then. When a big storm hits and a lot of streams hit a road and go down that road, and the storm is a big one, it can end up looking like this. Smaller examples than that may occur on the Mount Hood, and I know that they have. I just didn't have a picture of it. The reason I'm including this slide is because we did an assessment down on the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest in the Illinois basin of a small subwatershed of Sucker Creek, and it gives a fairly good representation of what you're going to find when you assess all of the roads that are on the system, including those, well, all the roads that are on the ground, including those that are not technically on the forest system. What we basically found is that about 45%, and this is about the mid-range of what we see, 45% of the total road length has the potential to deliver to streams. And that our assessment found that if those roads were treated, we could cut that down to about 10%. This was done by Pacific Watershed Associates. You'll see numbers anywhere between 35 and 75% connectivity to streams, which means that the road itself is basically delivering runoff to the stream in a discrete way. So that's a fairly big problem and a fairly big difference that we could make with treatment. Treatment means rerouting the runoff from the road from the road surface so that it is shunted off of the road surface at more frequent intervals and does not end up collecting and running down at a discrete point into the stream. So there are a number of different ways to do that. So then the other thing that you can do is you can identify specific sites where the problem exists and where the treatment would occur. In this particular case, there were 234 sites, and the point that I'm bringing up here is that some of those were sites that were on roads that weren't on the system. Not all of the roads that were not on the system needed treatment in our estimation, but some of them did, and some of them were fairly high risk. You can also estimate what the size of the sediment diverted is when you do these assessments. And at most of those sites, treatment was recommended. Most of those are going to be at stream crossings. It's fairly obvious, 2/3 of them, but not all of them. Not all of those sites are at stream crossings. So we can't assume that if we deal with stream crossings, we've got it. So basically, we know that these treatments are effective. This is a slide showing reductions in sediment delivery from road decommissioning. That's one action that you can take, which involves a whole set of different stabilization treatments. In some cases, doesn't involve very many if we're on a road that isn't highly connected to stream systems. We've talked about in some cases passive restoration is appropriate. In many cases, it is not. We also have some monitoring results coming out of the National Forests, the research station, the Rocky Mountain Research Station, that is taking charge of the monitoring of the Legacy Roads and Trails Remediation Program, which was first funded in 2008 to address aquatic risks from National Forest roads, priority aquatic risk from National Forest roads. It provided that little bit extra shot in the arm to forests nationwide, and as part of that, we worked very hard to make sure that there was monitoring funding included, and this is the result is now we're seeing some results coming from that research. We are seeing reduced road-to-stream hydrologic connectivity. We're seeing fewer miles of stream contributing sediment directly, miles of road contributing directly to streams. We're seeing that evidence in the stream. We're seeing less initiation of gullies, which basically also deliver sediment to the stream. So legally, we have all kinds of ways in which the Forest Service has a mandate to address roads. The general water and watershed protection language of the National Forest Management Act is one of those ways. The aquatic conservation strategy of the Northwest Forest Plan makes findings about the priority emphasis that ought to be placed on road-related watershed restoration. And national direction now goes quite a bit further to say that not just no net increase of roads in key watersheds, but what we need to do is actually assess the impacts of our roads and reduce the size of our road system to some minimum level, which has actually been a rule that's been in place since about 2000, when Mike Dombeck was chief of the Forest Service, not coincidentally a fish biologist, but we've had to be reminded of that mandate just recently through Forest Service Washington office direction. We also have the Clean Water Act. Lots of forest streams are impaired because of road impacts. Sediment and temperature, they are related. We also have Endangered Species Act listings, as I've mentioned. If you dive into the listing decisions and all those kinds of things, I'll get there, you'll find roads mentioned. The other imperative that I didn't headline was that fixing roads and reducing the road mileage on the system saves a lot of money, both in the short term actually and the long run. This graph shows that. Since my time is up, I have to keep going. Furthermore, according to this research, and I'd be really interested to know if any of the water providers in the room agree with these numbers in any kind of a way. This is often quoted, that investments in watershed protection and restoration result in significant savings to utilities in terms of water treatment and filtration. For every $1 invested in forest and watershed protection, you can save from $750 to $200 in treatment and filtration. That's a pretty big range. What does watershed protection mean in any case? We also know that investing in watershed restoration, road removal, and remediation creates jobs in places where we need them. But we are not going to be able to continue to address the problem, which in the state of Oregon is somewhere around $1 billion problem, if we do not continue to get appropriations from Congress, whether it's called legacy roads or something else. Right now, we'd prefer to call it legacy roads and trails. If we don't continue to work with some of these people on this screen, and if all the people in this room don't get involved in supporting that appropriation. We basically were successful in getting ourselves up to about $6 million in the state of Oregon, about over $2 million to the Mount Hood National Forest. But last year it was cut by 41%. And things are going to continue along those lines if we can't make a showing of broad support for the Legacy Roads and Trails program, the Forest Service. So what we're hoping is that folks will take a second look at the need to revisit a problem that we all think we know about, but we haven't addressed. And even if we assess what our needs are for restoration, it's going to be a long haul to pay for those restoration actions. So thanks.